Hello students and welcome to World History. Today we're going to go over Rise of Civilization Part 2. As we go through, remember to be taking notes as well as write down any questions you have. So in today's video, we will cover the Mesopotamian civilization, talk about the main factors of what makes a civilization and the main factors that cause the decline of a civilization. We'll update our timeline and go over some review and reminders. Before we begin, a reminder that to look at your important vocabulary as we go through. Check out our icons to look for items that will be on your test, prior information that we will be reviewing, as well as important details that you might want to pay attention to. Today's objective is students will learn about the rise of the first civilization and the factors that created it. Let's begin. So in today's class, we're going to talk about the civilization of Mesopotamia. So Mesopotamia began with the villages of Samar. Samar was one of the first early nations that developed around the world and what we today refer to as Mesopotamia. It began developing around 3500 BCE, that's before Common Era. And when we talk about civilization, a big thing to remember is that the word civilization comes from the Latin word civitas, which means city. So most early civilizations were actually cities. Not nations like we call them today, but they would develop into nations over time. So in today's class, we're going to talk about the main factors of what creates a civilization. So almost all civilizations need to have some form of trade network, need to have advancing technology, which I'll explain what that means later on. Needs to have some form of social structure, need to have some scholarship in writing, and needs to have law and/or government. And just a reminder that these early civilizations we're going to talk about all developed around the Fertile Crescent. And that's a large stretch of land from east shore of the Mediterranean Sea to the West Persian Gulf, known for its rich land and favorable climate, allowing for these early cities to form and create agriculture. So first off, economy. Economy is one of the main things that creates a civilization. Without a strong economy, there's no way to get the resources necessary to live. So the first thing I want to talk about is natural resources. Any city and any nation that we have today revolves around what natural resources they have, do not have, and are able to get. So Mesopotamia and the area around it was actually resource poor. It didn't have a lot of natural resources. That meant stones, metal, animals, fertile land. But one thing it did have was an abundance of clay and an abundance of grain, both of which they would sell and ship along the Mesopotamian rivers, the Euphrates and the Tigris, in order to buy other goods like salt, livestock, stone, metal, and wood. So they would use these riverways, the riverways in the Pacific Gulf, the Persian Gulf, to go to modern-day Turkey, where the Sumerian nations, as well as modern-day Afghanistan, to get precious stone, gold, and copper. And then along land, and they traveled on land, what is modern-day Lebanon, to get timber. So in general, they traveled up and down these rivers between the Mediterranean and the Persian Gulf in order to get the natural resources needed and to grow and develop their trade network. A part of this trade network was the advancing of technology. So any nation can have technology of that time, but when a nation begins to advance technology, that's what you really see as a civilization or growing civilization. So this means the growth or improvement or new ideas in technology. So in Samaria or Mesopotamia, we have artisans who would begin developing clay pottery. And something to know is historians love pottery. Pottery and pottery shards are one of the main artifacts that we have available to us today. And they're a great way to tell us history. People would paint on them, they would write on them. A lot of modern day knowledge about history comes from clay pottery. So it's historians' favorite artifact. At this time, you also have the development of the wheel. And they were at this time used to as ceramics that they would have the clay pots on, but over time they would develop into carts and pulling carts, but that would take a couple hundred years. As well, you would have the process of mixing metals. Mesopotamia would gain iron and copper from its trade and mix those metals together to make a more malleable metal called bronze. This would develop into our second age, moving out of the Stone Age and into the Bronze Age, and would develop our first bronze tools, including plowing tools, swords, knives, and other things. This process would also begin to spread across Asia and Europe a little later on in history. At this time, we also have the development of society. So culture really began to develop about 25,000 BCE when thousands of people began to congregate in Samaria, both through population growth and migration. So with more people, you begin to have mixing culture and classes and development of social structure. Social structure, also known as social hierarchy, is a really important concept when it comes to civilization. These early social structures usually had a form of, had upper class, middle class, and lower class. The upper class were kings, priests, and scholars, while middle class were soldiers, merchants, and artisans, while our lower class was free work laborers who worked in the, maybe they worked in mines, maybe they worked cleaning the streets, maybe they worked in the agricultural fields, or we had slaves who kind of did anything that was needed. So upper society would live in the open area homes in the middle part of the city, while the lower society would tend to live on the outskirts, which would create these cities that were kind of circular in nature, with the high society in the middle and the low society on the outside. Rings, very societal rings. At the same time, we have the development of religion. At this time, religion was polytheistic. Polytheism, which poly means many and theo means God, was developed of many gods in which different people would worship different gods, or people would worship lots of gods. And so why this happened, because remember we have our Paleolithic tribes would often have a tribal god. And when these tribes began to intermix, you have the mixing of gods, as well as creation of new gods as agriculture and other things developed. And so there are gods for everything, from flooding, seasons, love, war, justice, agricultural, life, and death. Everything pretty much had a god that ruled over it. And these gods would have temples known as ziggurats, and this is a ziggurat. Usually these temples were square platforms with stairs leading upwards, and so they would represent stairs leading up to the heavens where the gods lived. Actually, really interesting, in the Bible when it talks about the Babylonian tower, that tower that reaches to heaven, most likely they were talking about a ziggurat, because that's what they consider those towers to heaven to really be. Scholars were another big thing that developed during this time, specifically writing. Remember we talked about as people began not having to work as much and you had free labor, you would get scholars who would begin to study and want to know things. And the first thing they wanted to know was how to write. So we had this form of writing called pictograms, which you can see in our photo over here. And these pictures were often represented things like animals, products, grains, and amounts. These are used to record harvest, laws, and of course, taxes. The people who would take down this information, who knew how to write, were called scribes. And these were either scholars or merchants versed in writing, usually to keep track of goods and of course taxes, because everyone needs to know where their money is going. Over time, this process of writing began developing into the concepts instead of just things. And so each symbol represent a concept, phrase, a saying, or a sentence. And this is how we get early fables like the Epic of Gilgamesh, which talked about an early Sumerian king and his adventures. The process of writing that we would see in pictograms, where they would press reeds into softened clay to form pictures, and then the clay would harden and you would have a tablet of information. And this early form was called cuneiform, cuneus meaning wedge and form meaning shape. And so these picture represents early cuneiform pictures, and so you see these cross hatches and these little wedge shapes that would from long reeds that they would press into the clay. At this time, you also have the development of mathematics. You would have counting, of course, to count how much of harvest or item they had, as well as adding, subtracting, and simple multiplication. At this time, you would have numbers between 1 and 60 relatively available, as well as the development of Sumerian science like astronomy, engineering, and architecture, which developed around this math. And of course, you cannot have a civilization without government. Remember, we talked about as more people began to integrate together, we would see a mixing of cultures and a need for law and order. This type of government was called a theocracy at this time because their kings, the people in charge, would often be considered gods, children of gods, or divinely appointed by God. In Sumer, we had the concept of the divine right to rule, which was given by the god Enlil, which was the chief god of Sumer. And so the king at the time was chosen with the divine right to rule by the god Enlil. And so he ruled with a theocracy type rule, meaning having complete religious authority. Remember, we talked about civilization at the time were cities, and so states as we know them, or nations, were actually small city-states. So you would have individual city-states, and one ruler would be over each state, and over time that one ruler would conquer multiple states, and then that one ruler would be over multiple city-states, would become what we consider empires today. And we'll talk more about that as we get into the first empires. But for now, most of it was small city-states like Sumer. And kings would create the laws with the help of advisors, but king would have final say. The king decided whether or not a law was created, a law was gotten rid of, or something happened in the civilization. King was the final decision. Advisors were often lower nobility in royalty, like princes or brothers or sisters of the leading royalty or leading king, as well as wise men like scholars, scientists, and mathematicians. And then finally, we'd have religious leaders like shamans, magicians, and priests, all of which would encompass the government this time. And like I said, kings would have final say and dictate what rules were and weren't implemented in these city-states. However, like any good thing, it does come to an end. And so we did begin to see the decline of this civilization, the Mesopotamian civilization, around 24,000, 23,000 BCE. And this happened because of actually agriculture. So when they began to implement agriculture, they didn't know everything that needed to be known about how to grow and how things are grown. And one of the things they learned is this process called salinization. Sorry, I'm so bad saying that. But it meant the process of where salt accumulated along land masses near water. Remember that even though we have rivers that are freshwater rivers, they are connected to seas, and that seawater would flow in. And so when they built out these irrigation channels and pulled out the fresh water, the salt would accumulate and kind of congregate together, drying up that waterway. And so the waterway would dry up. On top of that, even though it had been quite a few hundred years since people were nomadic with hunter-gatherers, they still had that nature, that desire for moving if something went bad. They weren't going to try to fix it. They were just going to move on. And so after a while, when the Mesopotamian civilization began to decline, people would just, you know what, this isn't working. We're going to go over here where there is a nice piece of land. And so they just moved, as well as cultural differences. You have inner fighting between the different city-states because, remember, they have different culture, gods, and belief systems, as well as cultural change. New gods, views, and ideas of life began to develop as people moved from hunter-gathering to agriculture, and then from one type of agriculture to another. However, that doesn't mean this is the end of civilization. With every fall, a new empire rises. And so new empires formed nearby and throughout history. So we'll see lots of chances where a civilization will fall and a new one will rise to take its place. And it's just a cycle we see often in history. So our timeline, last week we talked about the early part of the end of the Ice Age, moving to from hunter-gathering to agriculture and the forming of cities. This week we talked about how in 3000 BCE we see the forming of Mesopotamia. This is the early Sumer became one of the first civilizations in our Fertile Crescent. And around 2500 BC, we see the development of tools and other things, introducing us to the Bronze Age, as well as the height of Sumerian culture and writing with ziggurat and cuneiform tablets. And around 2300 BCE, we see the end of Mesopotamian era. Okay, next week we'll talk about some of our other civilizations, but before we go, some major important things to remember. Remember, Samar was one of our first major civilizations, what we consider to be Mesopotamia today. Surplus creates trade. With a surplus, you're able to trade and gain goods across a nation, getting the things necessary for civilization. New tools in this era became known as the Bronze Age for their bronze tools. And social structure, early writing, and kings, which were appointed a god, developed the first instances of a civilization. Remember, all civilizations rise and fall with time. Remember back our keyword civilization, which means civitas, which means city. So our challenge question, what are the factors that created the rise and fall of civilization? Think about this question and complete your post-lecture assessment. Take down any questions you have. Feel free to email, call, or come to office hours if you need help, and I will see you all in live lectures. Have a great day.